Giant Cowboy hadn't kissed a woman in 12 years. Until she whispered, "Please cut these ropes." Snow was falling hard that night, dusting the main street white. The big man with the weathered coat was just heading home till he heard the faint cry from the alley. There she was, barefoot, wrists bound, eyes burning through the cold. He freed her, but before he could ask her name, she was gone, leaving only a silver hairpin with a mark no town man could mistake. By morning, the law was calling her a thief. The railroad wanted her silenced. And the man who freed her was now the only one standing between her and the noose. But the truth she carried wasn't about stolen gold, was about the land and the water every soul in this valley needs to live. In a town where the badge serves the railroad and lies travel faster than the wind. Will the giant cowboy risk everything to keep her safe? Or will the ropes she escaped that night be waiting for her at dawn? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The wind howled through Splitrek's empty streets, driving needles of snow against Levi Cade's face as he guided his sorrel gelding through the deepening drifts. The leather of his saddle creaked with each careful step. His broad shoulders hunched against the bitter cold while he kept one hand pressed to his hat, preventing the cruel gusts from claiming it. The sheriff's barn loomed ahead, its weathered boards barely visible through the white curtain of snow. Levi's jaw tightened as he remembered another winter storm. 12 years ago, when he'd lost Sarah, the memory of her still ached like a broken bone that hadn't set right. "Easy there, Buck," he murmured to his horse, patting the gelding's sturdy neck. The animal snorted, steam rising from his nostrils as Levi dismounted. His boots crunched in the fresh powder while he led Buck into the relative shelter of the barn's overhang. Working quickly, Levi unloaded the supplies he'd promised the sheriff: metal containers of kerosene, sacks of feed, and boxes of ammunition. His fingers, though protected by thick leather gloves, grew stiff with cold as he stacked everything neat and proper. A man's word was his bond. And Levi had promised these supplies would arrive before the storm hit full force. With the delivery complete, he turned Buck toward the livery stable. The snow was falling harder now, muffling all sound except the whistle of wind between buildings. The street was deserted. Any soul with sense was inside, warming themselves by a fire. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he nearly missed it. A cry, weak and strained, coming from the narrow alley behind the telegraph office. Levi reined Buck to a stop, listening hard. There it was again, definitely human. "Hold here," he told Buck, looping the reins around a hitching post. Drawing his coat tighter, Levi made his way toward the sound, his hand instinctively resting. Near his holstered Colt, the alley was dark, shadowed by the surrounding buildings. Snow had drifted against the walls, and there, huddled against a rain barrel, he saw her. A young woman, barefoot in the snow, her wrists bound cruel and tight with rawhide. Dark bruises marked her face, visible even in the dim light. She lifted her head at his approach, and Levi saw fear flash in her eyes before being replaced by desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice rough, "cut these ropes." Levi stood frozen for a heartbeat. This was trouble, plain as day, and trouble had a way of multiplying once you got involved. But leaving a woman bound and freezing in an alley, that wasn't even a choice a decent man could consider. He pulled out his pocket knife, the bone handle smooth and familiar in his grip. Kneeling beside her, he noticed how she tensed at his nearness, though she held still as he carefully worked the blade between her skin and the bindings. The rawhide was pulled tight enough to break skin, and anger stirred in his chest at such cruelty. "Almost there," he said softly, keeping his movements slow and steady. The knife's sharp blade made quick work of the bonds, and they fell away, leaving angry red marks on her wrists. She rubbed at the welts, then used the rain barrel to pull herself upright. Levi started to ask her name, to offer help, but before he could form the words, she bolted. Quick as a startled deer, she darted past him and vanished into the swirling snow. "Wait!" he called, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. Something glinted in the snow where she had been. Levi bent down and picked up a silver hairpin, its surface etched with an intricate Apache sun symbol. The craftsmanship was fine. The design? Speaking of both beauty and heritage, he turned it over in his hands, studying the detailed patterns before carefully tucking it into his coat pocket. Standing there in the silent alley, snow collecting on his shoulders, Levi felt unsettled in a way he hadn't in years. Something was very wrong in Split Rock, and that woman, whoever she was in the thick of it. The marks on her wrists and face told a story of violence he couldn't ignore. Even if he wanted to, he made his way back to Buck, who stood patient and steady despite the weather. The snow was falling so thick now he could barely see the next building down the street. As he mounted up, his hand brushed against his pocket, feeling the shape of the hairpin within. He had a strong feeling he hadn't seen the last of its owner. And that thought stirred something in him he'd thought long buried a need to protect. To make things right, the wind cut, sharp as a knife, as Levi guided Buck toward the livery, the storm closing in around them like a white shroud. But his mind stayed fixed on the woman's face, on the mix of fear and determination he'd seen there. 12 years of keeping to himself, of nursing old wounds, and now this. Sometimes, he reckoned, a man's peaceful life got disrupted for a reason. The thought didn't comfort him much as he urged Buck onward through the deepening snow. The line? Shack's pot-bellied stove threw warm shadows across rough-hewn walls, but Levi found no peace in its familiar comfort. He sat in his worn leather chair, boots propped near the flames, turning the silver hairpin over and over in his calloused hands. The Apache sun symbol caught the firelight, seeming to dance as he studied its intricate pattern. Sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's bruised face, felt the wrongness of those cruel rawhide bindings. The storm had settled into a steady whisper outside, and his thoughts kept circling back to where she might be in such bitter weather. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Levi saddled Buck and rode the short distance into town. Fresh snow blanketed everything, pristine, except for a few early tracks leading to the general store. The bell above Whitaker's general store jingled as he pushed through the door, bringing with him a swirl of cold air. "Morning, Levi," old Tom Whitaker called from behind the counter. "Nasty weather we're having." Levi nodded, stamping snow from his boots. The store was already busy with morning shoppers, their voices rising and falling like disturbed chickens. He made his way toward the coffee beans, but stopped short when he heard Deputy Whitaker's sharp voice cutting through the general chatter. "That half-Apache woman's dangerous," the deputy was saying to a cluster of townspeople. "Broke into the Depot Hotel last night and made off with the entire railroad payroll. Sheriff's got men searching, but this snow's made tracking difficult." "You mean Maribel, the seamstress?" Mrs. Peterson asked, clutching her shawl. "But she's always seemed so quiet, so proper-like." "Can't trust them mixed bloods," Deputy Whitaker spat. "She's probably halfway to Mexico by now." Levi's jaw tightened, but he kept his peace, gathering his supplies with deliberate care. The deputy's words didn't match with what he'd seen. A bound, beaten woman who'd fled into the storm. Something wasn't right. At the livery stable, he found more answers, though not the kind he'd expected. Mrs. Abigail Boyle was there, checking on her mare. She'd mended Levi's coats more times than he could count, and he'd always found her to be a shrewd judge of character. "A moment, Mr. Cade," she called softly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. When he approached, she lowered her voice. Further, I expect you've heard the talk about Maribel Ortega. Some, he replied, equally quiet. Don't believe a word of it. Mrs. Boyle's eyes flashed with contained anger. That girl's no thief. She's the only one brave enough to stand up. To the railroad. They're trying to evict a dozen widows from their homes out on Cottonwood Creek, claiming the land grant's invalid. Maribel's got proof that says different. The deputy seems mighty certain about that payroll theft. Deputy Whitaker's been in the railroad's pocket since they pinned that badge on him. She patted her horse's neck, using the motion to lean closer. Mark my words, Mr. Cade, whatever happened last night, that girl needs help, not hunting. The conversation stayed with Levi through the afternoon as he tended to chores around his property. As evening approached, he made several trips to bring in firewood, stacking it carefully beside the stove. On his final trip, arms full of split logs, a slight movement caught his eye, a shadow shifting in the hayloft that shouldn't have been there. Setting down the wood, Levi retrieved his lantern and lit it with steady hands. He climbed the ladder, slowly, making no effort to silence his approach. The hay rustled softly as he reached the top, and his light fell across a huddled form beneath one of his saddle blankets. "Come on out," he said quietly. "I ain't aiming to hurt you. The blanket moved, and Maribel emerged, frost crystallized on her dark lashes. Her face was still bruised, but her eyes were clear and direct as she looked at him. "You're the man from the alley," she said. "I remember your kindness, and you're the seamstress they're all looking for." He set the lantern down between them. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" "Please," she whispered, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Don't turn me in. I know I have no right to ask for shelter, but I swear I'm not what they're saying. Give me until morning, and I'll explain everything." Levi studied her for a long moment. She was shivering, but there was steel in her spine, dignity in how she held herself despite her circumstances. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver hairpin. "This belonged to you." Her hand went instinctively to her hair. "My mother's," she said softly. "A gift from her people before she married my father." He held it out to her. "Come down to the cabin. You'll freeze up here, and I reckon we both could use some coffee while you tell me your story. You'd trust me just like that." "Way I see it, a woman who keeps her hair pinned but loses her shoes probably has a tale worth hearing." He gestured toward the ladder. "But I want the truth come morning, every bit of it." Maribel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Cade. Levi Cade." He picked up the lantern. "And you can thank me by explaining why Deputy Whitaker's so set on finding you." By morning, she promised, gathering herself to follow him. "Down. You have my word." The wind had picked up again outside, driving fresh snow against the windows as they made their way to the cabin. Levi added wood to the stove and set coffee to boil, all too aware of the risk he was taking, but watching Maribel warm her hands by the fire. He knew he couldn't have done differently. Sometimes a man's conscience left him no choice but to get involved. No matter how much simpler life might be if he didn't. The scent of fresh coffee roused Levi from his sleep in the chair where he'd dozed off. Gray pre-dawn light filtered through. Frosted windows and the pot-bellied stove crackled with new life. For a moment, the domestic sounds stirred memories of Rachel, his late wife, but then Maribel's quiet movements in his small kitchen brought him fully awake. She'd already stoked the fire and set coffee to boil, moving with the careful precision of someone used to being quiet. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and she'd washed her face, though the bruises still showed stark against her skin. "Hope you don't mind," she said, noticing his open eyes. "Seemed the least I could do, after your kindness." Levi straightened in his chair, working out the stiffness in his neck. Been a while since anyone tended that stove but me. He paused, then added, coffee smells good. She found 2 tin cups and poured them each a measure. I also made some. Biscuits, found flour in your pantry. Hope that was all right. More than all right. He accepted the coffee and watched as she retrieved a pot of beans she'd set to warm. The domestic scene felt strange, yet somehow familiar. Like an echo of something long forgotten. They sat at his small table, steam rising from their cups. Outside, the wind still moaned, carrying fresh snow against the windows. Levi waited until they'd both taken a few bites before speaking. Reckon it's morning now, he said quietly. Time for that explanation you promised. Maribel set down her cup, her expression growing serious. Yes, I suppose it is. She reached into her skirt pocket and withdrew a folded document, carefully protected in oilskin. This is what the deputy really wants. Why they had me tied up in that alley. Levi wiped his hands carefully before accepting the paper. The document was official looking, with several signatures and a territorial seal. As he read, his eyebrows drew together. This is a water rights grant, he said. For the widow settlement out on Cottonwood Creek. Signed and registered 15 years ago. Maribel nodded. It guarantees them access to the well that serves their lands. Without it, they'd have no water rights at all. And the railroad wants that water. They're laying track through the valley. Need water for their steam engines. Her voice held controlled anger. They've been trying to prove the settlement's claims aren't valid, that the widows have no legal right to stay. This document proves otherwise. Levi studied the paper carefully. So they invented this payroll theft story to discredit you? Deputy. Whitaker did more than that. He planted false evidence in my room at the boarding house. Her hands tightened around her cup. I caught him doing it. That's when his men grabbed me, tied me up. They wanted me to sign a confession, say I'd forged the grant, but you got away. They got careless. Left me alone for a moment. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. My mother's people taught me how to slip bonds if I had to, though I lost my shoes in the process. Levi folded the document carefully, handed it back. You understand that by hiding you here, I'm making myself an accessory. I do. She met his gaze steadily. I'll leave by sundown. I won't bring trouble to your door. He rose and walked to the window, studying the swirling snow. The storm had worsened overnight, and the drifts were getting deeper. Going anywhere in this weather would be asking to freeze to death. He turned. Back to her. You'll stay until it clears. Relief flickered across her face, quickly hidden. Thank you. I won't forget this. They spent the morning in companionable silence, Levi taking care of essential chores while Maribel tidied the cabin. By afternoon, the storm showed no signs of letting up, so they moved to the barn where it was warmer to work on some damaged tack. That needed mending. Levi was impressed by how quickly and surely she worked with the leather. You've done this? Before my father ran cattle in Sonora, she explained, her needle moving steadily. I learned to repair tack before I learned to sew dresses. She glanced up at him. Though these days, dressmaking pays better. As they worked, the conversation grew easier. Levi found himself sharing small stories about his ranch, his cattle, the challenges of working the land alone. Maribel listened. Well, asking questions that showed she understood ranch life intimately. When evening approached, they returned to the cabin. Over another simple meal, Maribel spoke more about her unusual upbringing, moving between two worlds. My mother's people. The Apache took my father in when his horse went lame near their camp, Ski said, her voice soft with memory. He was just a young vaquero then, working other men's cattle. T learned their ways, earned their respect. When he married my mother, both peoples celebrated. Must have been hard, straddling those two worlds, Levi observed. Sometimes, but also rich. She touched the silver hairpin, now back in her dark hair. I learned to see with different eyes, to understand different ways of thinking. My mother taught me her people's medicines, their respect for the land. My father taught me cattle and horses, and how to read the weather in the sky. Levi nodded, understanding better now her quiet confidence, the dignity that hardship hadn't diminished. And now you're fighting for those widows' water rights. They took me in when I first came to town, treated me like family. Her voice grew determined. I won't let them lose their homes, not while I have proof of their rights in my hands. Night settled over the cabin, the storm still raging outside. Levi added wood to the stove, watching Maribel mend a tear in one of his shirts with the same sure hands that had repaired his tack. Something about her presence made the cabin feel less empty, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for such quiet company. The next morning brought welcome quiet as the storm finally eased. Sunlight glinted off snow-laden branches, and the drifts had settled enough to make travel possible. Levi stood at his cabin door, studying the sky while adjusting his coat collar. I need to ride into town for supplies, he told Maribel, who was clearing their breakfast dishes. Stay in the hayloft, out of sight. There's bread and jerky if you get hungry. She nodded, her face serious. Be careful. The deputy has eyes everywhere. I reckon so. Levi checked his gun belt, more from habit than worry. I'll be back before sundown. The ride into town was slow going. His sorrel gelding picked its way carefully through the snow-packed street, steam puffing from its nostrils. The town was starting to wake up, smoke rising from chimneys. A few early risers already about their business at the mercantile. Levi tied his horse and stomped the snow from his boots before entering. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped. Inside, Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife, looked up from her ledger and gave him a wan smile. Morning, Mr. Cade. Quite a storm we had. Yes, ma'am. He began gathering what he needed: coffee, flour, ammunition for his rifle. He was reaching for a tin of matches when a smooth voice spoke behind him. Mr. Cade, just the man I wanted to see. Levi turned slowly. Mr. Halpern stood there in his fine Eastern suit, looking as polished as if he'd just stepped out of a city lawyer's office. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Mind if we have a word? Halpern gestured toward a quiet corner of the store. Levi followed, his face carefully neutral. What can I do for you, Mr. Halpern? The lawyer lowered his voice. I'll be direct, Mr. Cade. We have reason to believe that Miss Ortega is somewhere in the vicinity of your property. He paused, studying Levi's expression. She's wanted for theft, you understand? Quite a serious matter. So I've heard. Levi's voice remained level. The railroad is prepared to be generous to anyone who helps bring this unfortunate situation to a close. Halpern reached into his vest pocket and withdrew an envelope. A finder's fee, shall we say? And of course, we'd be happy to renew your grazing lease for another 5 years, at very favorable terms. Levi looked at the envelope, but made no move. To take it, that's mighty generous of the railroad. We believe in rewarding civic responsibility. Halpern's smile tightened. Of course, harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. It would be a shame if someone with your reputation found himself on the wrong side of the law. It would indeed. Levi met the lawyer's gaze steadily. But a man's reputation also depends on knowing right from wrong. Mr. Halpern, good day to you. He turned away, gathered his supplies, and paid Mrs. Peterson as he stepped out into the snow-bright morning. He could feel Halpern's eyes boring into his back, loading the supplies into his saddlebags. Levi noticed movement down the street. Deputy Whitaker stood in front of the jail, watching him. The deputy made no move to approach, but as Levi mounted up and headed home, he caught glimpses of a rider following at a distance, The sun was past its peak when Levi finally rode into his yard. Maribel met him at the barn door, her face tight. With worry, "Someone rode around the property while you were gone," she said, as she helped him unload the supplies. Circled twice, staying just at the edge of the trees. Whitaker's men, most likely. Levi secured his gelding in its stall. They're getting bolder. Inside the cabin, Levi told her about his encounter with Halpern while they prepared a simple stew for supper. Maribel listened intently, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables. "They're worried," she said finally. "The railroad's whole plan depends on proving the widows have no legal claim to that water. Which means that grant you're carrying is even more important than I thought." Levi stirred the stew, then turned to face her. "If you trust me enough, I'd like to see it. Need to know exactly what we're protecting." Maribel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She went to her bundle in the loft and returned with a carefully folded parchment. The edges were worn from handling, but the territorial seal remained clear and intact. Levi read it carefully by lamplight while their supper simmered. The grant was detailed and specific, outlining water rights and property boundaries for the widow's settlement. It had been properly filed and witnessed 15 years earlier. "This is ironclad," he said finally. "No wonder they want to destroy it. But what can we do?" Maribel took the document back, handling it like something precious. "They control the town. The deputy watches every move." Levi was quiet for a moment, thinking. "The county courthouse in Mason City, that's where this needs to be filed. Once it's recorded there, they can't make it disappear. Mason City is 3 days' ride. 2, if we push it." He served them both bowls of stew. "The snow-packed road should be clear enough by day after tomorrow. We can take the back trail through Carter's Pass. It's longer, but the deputy's men won't expect that route." Maribel's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. You'll need someone who knows the trail." Levi's voice was matter-of-fact, "and someone to watch your back." "Why would you risk this?" Her dark eyes searched his face. "You've already done more than most would." Levi considered his words carefully. "Because it's right. And because I've watched the railroad push too many people off their land already." He met her gaze. "That grant represents more than just water rights. It represents hope for folks who've had precious little of it." Maribel was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. 2 days, then time enough to prepare. They finished their meal in companionable silence, each lost in thought about the journey ahead. Outside, the snow had stopped completely, and a pale moon rose over the white blanketed landscape. In 2 days, they would make their bid to protect the widow's future. But for now, they had preparation to do and plans to make. The next morning dawned crisp and bright. The storm clouds finally pushed east by a persistent wind. Levi stepped out of his cabin into knee-deep snow, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the white landscape in shades of pink and gold dot inside. Maribel was already up, wrapping dried meat and hardtack in oilcloth. She worked with quick, precise movements, her dark hair neatly braided and pinned back. "The weather's holding. Clear as far as I can see," Levi confirmed, stamping snow from his boots. "We should make good time if we leave within the hour." They worked together efficiently, loading supplies onto a small wooden sled Levi had pulled from his barn. The runners were smooth, well-maintained despite years of storage. Blankets, food, coffee, and extra ammunition went in first, followed by feed for the horses and dry firewood wrapped in canvas. My wife Sarah used to say a well-packed sled was worth its weight in gold, Levi said quietly, securing the last rope. He paused, surprised at how naturally her name had come to his lips. It had been years since he'd spoken of her so easily. Maribel looked up from adjusting her borrowed coat. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Levi checked the horses' harnesses one final time. Fierce, too. Wouldn't back down from anything she believed in. He glanced at Maribel. Reminds me of someone else I know. A ghost of a smile crossed her face as she mounted her horse, a sturdy bay mare Levi had insisted she ride instead of his younger gelding. The sled runners creaked as they set out. Breaking trail through the pristine snow, they rode in comfortable silence through the morning. Levi leading the way along the lesser-known trail through Carter's Pass. The sun climbed higher, glinting off ice-covered branches and making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Around midday, they stopped in a small clearing to rest the horses and share a simple meal of jerky and hard bread. It must have been difficult, Maribel said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Losing her so young. Levi studied his coffee cup for a long moment. It was. Still is, some days. He looked up at the winter sky. But she taught me that loving someone means carrying them with you, not letting grief shut you away from the world. My mother used to say something similar, Maribel offered. In Apache, we believe our loved ones walk beside us even when we can't see them. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. But sometimes walking between two worlds feels very lonely. Too Apache for some, too Mexican for others. And now you're fighting for both, Levi observed. The widow's settlement is the only place I've found where that doesn't matter. Her voice grew stronger. Where people are judged by their actions, not their bloodlines. They pressed on through the afternoon, the horses' hooves and sled runners, making the only sound in the hushed winter landscape. As the sun began to sink, Levi led them into a sheltered grove of pine trees. The branches had kept most of the snow off the ground, making it easier to set up camp. This should do, he said, surveying the natural windbreak. We'll need to be careful with the fire, but the canvas tarp will help contain the light. They worked together to make camp, falling into an easy rhythm. Levi tended to the horses while Maribel cleared a space for the fire. Soon, a small flame flickered beneath the canvas tarp they'd strung between three trees, providing both warmth and concealment. The cold pressed in as night fell, but Levi kept feeding small branches to the fire, maintaining a steady warmth. They sat close to the flames, sharing coffee and the last of the day's bread. Maribel began humming softly, an Apache lullaby that seemed to blend with the whisper of wind through the pines. Levi shifted, then the silver hairpin in his pocket caught the firelight. Maribel's eyes flickered to it, but she didn't speak, continuing. Her gentle song, the melody spoke of stars and seasons, of patience and endurance, themes that seemed fitting for their journey. When the song ended, Levi broke the silence. We should reach Mason City by mid-afternoon tomorrow, if the weather holds. Maribel nodded, her face serious in the firelight. And then we'll see if the law truly stands for justice. They took turns keeping watch through the night, though no riders appeared on their trail. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the winter sky, until false dawn began to paint the eastern horizon. They broke camp early, leaving no trace of their presence except for the compressed snow where they'd slept. The morning was colder than the day before, but the sky remained clear. They made good time. The horses fresh and eager in the crisp air. The sun had passed its peak when the first buildings of Mason City came into view. Sturdy brick structures that spoke of permanence and law. Levi felt Maribel straighten in her saddle beside him, her face set with determination. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She touched the place where the land grant was secured inside her coat. "Ready?" The Mason City courthouse stood 3 stories tall, its red brick walls a stark contrast against the snow-covered ground. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and old paper. Levi and Maribel's boots echoed on the wooden floors as they made their way to the clerk's office. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles named Mr. Peterson, looked up from his ledger as they entered. His eyebrows rose slightly at Maribel's presence, but his voice remained professionally courteous. "How may I assist you today?" Maribel stepped forward, producing the carefully preserved document. "I need to file this land grant, sir. It secures water rights for a settlement outside of Copper Creek." Mr. Peterson adjusted his spectacles and examined the parchment with careful hands. His eyes widened slightly as he read, "This bears Judge Kellum's signature and seal." He glanced up. "The judge is actually here today, holding circuit court. Given the nature of this document, I believe he'd want to see it." They waited while Mr. Peterson disappeared through a heavy oak door. Minutes later, he returned with Judge Kellum, a tall man with iron-gray hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to look straight through pretense. "Miss Ortega," the judge said, nodding to Maribel. "I remember signing this grant nearly 6 months ago, wasn't it?" "Yes, Your Honor." Maribel's voice was steady. "The railroad's men have been trying to prevent me from filing it." Judge Kellum's expression darkened. "Have they indeed?" He examined the document again, running a finger along its unbroken seal. "Mr. Peterson, please record this grant immediately. Witness the filing myself." The clerk brought out the heavy record book, its pages filled with neat columns of property transactions. His pen scratched across the paper as he entered the details, while Judge Kellum watched with sharp eyes. "You should know," the judge said quietly to Maribel and Levi, "that the railroad may still contest this filing. They've done it before, but now it's part of the public record, which makes their job considerably harder." "Thank you, Your Honor," Maribel whispered, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "Don't thank me," Judge Kellum replied. "I merely upheld the law. It's you who had the courage to bring this forward." He turned to Mr. Peterson. "Make 3 certified copies, please. 1 for the territorial office, 1 for Miss Ortega, and 1 for our files." While they waited for the copies, the judge spoke with Levi about cattle prices and winter grazing conditions, his manner deliberately casual. But his eyes were keen, and Levi suspected he understood more about their situation than he let on. The next morning, they attended services at Mason City's small wooden church. Sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air. The congregation was small but welcoming, and no one questioned Maribel's presence among them. The minister spoke of faith that could move mountains, and Levi noticed Maribel wiping tears from her eyes during the final hymn. They began their journey home that afternoon, the precious copies of the grant secured in Maribel's saddlebags. The return trip seemed easier, as if a great weight had been lifted from both their shoulders. They made good time, arriving at Levi's shack just as the sun was setting. Word spread quickly among the widow's settlement. As darkness fell, lantern light bobbed across the snow-covered ground as the women made their way to Levi's home. They came bearing gifts, fresh-baked bread still warm from the oven, jars of preserved peaches and wild plum jam, even a hand-knit scarf that Mrs. Boyle pressed into Levi's hands. The small cabin filled with warmth and conversation. Maribel moved among the women, speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish, her face animated as she described their success. Levi had never heard her laugh before, but now the sound rang out clear and joyful, mingling with the other voices. Mrs. Rodriguez, the eldest of the widows, caught Levi's arm as he passed. "God sent you to help us," she said in careful English. "We will not forget." Levi shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. "Maribel did all the hard work. I just provided transportation." The old woman's eyes twinkled. "Is that what you call it?" She patted his arm and moved away before he could respond. As the evening wore on, the women began to depart in small groups, carrying their lanterns to light the way home. Levi stood on his porch, watching until the last light disappeared into the darkness. The night was clear and cold, stars sharp as knife points in the black sky. Something made him pause before going inside. A shadow moved where no shadow should be, near the corner of his barn. His hand dropped to the colt at his hip as he stepped off the porch. Boots crunching in the snow. The shadow was already gone, but the tracks remained distinctive boot prints with a star-shaped mark on the heel. Deputy Whitaker's custom-made. Boots were well known in town. Levi followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared into the darkness beyond his property. The deputy's presence was a clear message. Their victory at the courthouse hadn't gone unnoticed, and trouble was sure to follow. Inside, Maribel was banking the fire for the night, humming softly to herself. Levi didn't mention the tracks, no need to darken her moment of triumph, but he made sure his colt was cleaned and loaded before he went to bed, and he slept lightly, waking at every sound from outside 2 days after the widow's celebration. Winter sunshine glinted off the fresh snow. Levi hitched his sorrel gelding to the supply wagon, checking the harness twice before heading into town. The morning air felt crisp and clean, carrying the promise of a clear day ahead. "Keep an eye on things," he told Maribel before leaving. She nodded from the doorway, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The filed grant had given her new confidence, but caution still shadowed her eyes. The trip into town took longer than usual. The wagon wheels cut through crusty snow, leaving deep ruts in their wake. Levi's mind wandered to the boot prints he'd seen outside the barn. Deputy Whitaker hadn't shown his face since then, which worried him more than if the man had confronted them directly at the general store. Mrs. Henderson took her time filling his order, chattering about everything except what he could tell. She wanted to discuss. Finally, while measuring out coffee beans, she leaned close. "That deputy's been asking questions about your comings and goings," she whispered. "Been watching your place too, according to my Tommy." "You be careful, Levi." "Cade." Levi thanked her with a touch of his hat brim, loaded his supplies, and headed back with a growing sense of unease. The sun had passed its peak when he turned onto the rutted track leading to his shack. From a distance, something looked wrong. The door stood slightly open, swaying in the light breeze. His heart began to pound. He'd taught Maribel to keep that door latched, especially when alone. Pulling the wagon to a halt, he swung down, his boots crunching in the snow. Fresh tracks led to and from the cabin, multiple sets of boots. One pair marking the distinctive star pattern of Deputy Whitaker's heels. "Maribel?" His voice echoed in the empty yard. No answer came from the open door. Inside, the cabin showed signs of a struggle. A chair lay overturned. Maribel's shawl sprawled across the floor like a fallen bird. A cup of tea had spilled across the table, the liquid now frozen in brown streaks on the wood. The tracks led away from the cabin, heading toward town. Levi didn't bother unhitching the wagon. He mounted his gelding and followed the trail at a gallop. Snow sprang from his horse's hooves. The sheriff's office squatted at the end of Main Street, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Levi dismounted, taking deep breaths to calm his racing pulse. He couldn't help Maribel if he let anger cloud his judgment. Inside, Sheriff Morton sat at his desk, examining papers with exaggerated attention. Deputy Whitaker leaned against the wall near the cells, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. And there, behind iron bars, sat Maribel. Her face was composed, but Levi could see the tension in her shoulders. "What's the meaning of this?" Levi kept his voice level, though his hands wanted to curl into fists. The deputy straightened, touching his badge as if to remind everyone of his authority. "We found evidence linking Miss Ortega to the railroad. Payroll theft, that silver hairpin she's so fond of. It turned up in the strongbox where the money was kept." "That's impossible," Levi said. "That pin's been in my possession since he stopped, realizing his mistake too late." "Since when, Mr. Cade?" Deputy Whitaker's smile widened. since you helped her hide the money. Now, Carl, Sheriff Morton interrupted. Let's not go making accusations without proof. But his tone lacked conviction, and he wouldn't meet Levi's eyes. May I speak with her? Levi asked. Alone. The sheriff nodded, but Deputy Whitaker pushed away from the wall. I don't think 5 minutes, Sheriff Morton said firmly. In my office, Carl, wait outside. The deputy's face darkened, but he complied. Once the door closed behind them, Levi approached the cell. Maribel stood, wrapping her fingers around the iron bars. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. Try to implicate you too. Tell me what happened. They came while you were gone. The deputy had a warrant. Her voice trembled slightly. He went straight to the loose floorboard under my pallet in the loft, like he knew exactly where to look. That's where he found my hairpin, wrapped in a handkerchief with the railroad's mark. But I've had your pin since the night I found you, Levi said. It's still in my coat pocket. I know. Maribel's dark eyes met his, which means they had another made. They're not going to stop, Levi. The railroad wants that water rights grant invalidated, and they'll use any means to discredit me. She reached through the bars, touching his hand. Go home. Please. Don't risk your ranch over this. You know I can't do that. Yes, you can. You must. Her fingers tightened on his. I won't see another good person's life destroyed because of me. The widows have their grant now. It's filed and witnessed. That's what matters. Before Levi could argue further, boots scraped outside the door. Deputy Whitaker's shadow fell across the threshold. Time's up, the deputy announced with obvious satisfaction. Levi held Maribel's gaze for a moment longer, trying to convey what he couldn't say aloud. Then he turned and walked out, past the deputy's smirking face, into the gathering dusk. The ride home seemed longer than usual. His gelding's hooves made hollow sounds in the packed snow, and the setting sun painted the white landscape in shades of rose and purple. By the time he reached his cabin, full dark had fallen. He fed and watered his horse, banked the stove, and lay down on his bunk, fully clothed. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to the deputy's smug expression. The planted evidence, the careful timing of it all. The railroad was playing a longer game than simple theft accusations. They wanted to destroy Maribel's credibility before she could testify about the grant. The hours crept by. Moonlight painted silver squares on his cabin floor through the window. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Levi stared at the ceiling, turning possibilities over in his mind like cards in a deck. Searching for the right play that would free Maribel without springing whatever trap the deputy had set dawn brought a pale winter sun and fresh determination. Levi saddled his gelding early, the leather creaking in the cold as he singed the girth. His breath made clouds in the frosty air while he considered his next move. Mrs. Boyle knew most of what happened in town. If anyone had useful information, it would be her. He found her at her kitchen table, sorting through a basket of mending. The warm scent of fresh bread filled the small room, and a pot of coffee bubbled on the wood stove. She looked up as he knocked on the open door frame, her quick eyes taking in his troubled expression. Come in out of that cold, Levi Cade, she said, pulling out a chair. You look like a man who needs to talk. Levi removed his hat, settling into the offered seat. Mrs. Boyle poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and pushed it toward him. Steam curled up from the dark liquid, carrying the rich aroma of chicory. I reckon you've heard about Maribel, he said quietly. Mrs. Boyle's mouth tightened. That deputy's been strutting around town like a rooster in a new henhouse, showing off that silver hairpin like it proves something. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. But I saw something interesting at the freight office 2 days ago. That same deputy picked up an unmarked package came special delivery on the railroad car. Levi's hands tightened around the warm mug. 2 days ago? Indeed. Mrs. Boyle's needles clicked as she resumed her mending. Right after that, he spent a good hour in private conversation with that railroad lawyer, Mr. Halpern. They looked mighty pleased with themselves when they came out. Did anyone else notice? Tom Henderson's boy was sweeping the store porch. Said he overheard the deputy bragging about some kind of promotion coming his way. She paused, studying Levi's face. Once the railroad gets what it wants, that is. Levi took a slow sip of coffee, letting the information settle in his mind. Much obliged for telling me this. Be careful, Levi. Mrs. Boyle set down her mending, her expression serious. That deputies ambitious men can be dangerous when cornered. I've seen his type before. They'll do whatever it takes to climb higher, no matter who they step on. Levi nodded, finishing his coffee in thoughtful silence. After thanking Mrs. Boyle, he spent the rest of the morning making his way through town, listening more than talking. At the general store, he learned the deputy had been measuring 4 new curtains in the sheriff's office like he's already planning to move in. The shopkeeper's wife said with a disapproving sniff. The telegraph operator mentioned seeing Deputy Whitaker sending frequent messages to the railroad's regional office. Unusual amount of traffic, he commented. Careful to maintain professional discretion while still conveying his concern. By late afternoon, a pattern had emerged. The deputy wasn't just following railroad orders, he was actively courting their favor. Expecting significant rewards once Maribel was discredited and the water rights grant invalidated. As dusk approached, Levi made his decision. Direct confrontation. Carried risks, but waiting would only give the deputy more time to strengthen his web of lies. He knew Whitaker's habits from years of observation. The man always tended his horse after sunset. Preferring to avoid the busy hours at the livery, Levi positioned himself in the shadows of an empty stall. His back against the rough wooden wall, the sweet smell of hay filled the air, mingling with leather and horse. Outside, the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, leaving only the dim glow of the livery's single lantern. The wait stretched long enough that his legs began to cramp. But Levi remained still. His patience was rewarded when boot steps crunched in the snow outside. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of cold air and Deputy Whitaker's whistling figure. The deputy moved confidently through the dim barn, heading for his horse's stall. He didn't notice Levi until he stepped out of the shadows, blocking the narrow aisle. Whitaker's hand dropped to his gun, but Levi's quiet voice stopped him. That would be a mistake, deputy. Cade. Whitaker's face twisted into a sneer, though his hand stayed near his weapon. Come to confess about helping that thief. Come to talk about that package you received from the railroad. Levi kept his tone conversational, but his eyes never left the deputy's face. The one that arrived just before you found that silver. Hairpin, color drained from Whitaker's face, replaced quickly by anger. You're in dangerous territory, making accusations against an officer of the law. Not making accusations, just stating facts. Levi took a step forward, his size advantage becoming more apparent in the confined space. Fact is, you've been promising to deliver something to the railroad. Fact is, you're expecting a promotion once you do. And fact is, I still have Maribel's real hairpin in my pocket. The deputy's hand twitched toward his gun again, but Levi's steady gaze made him reconsider. You can't prove anything. Don't need to prove it. Just need people asking the right questions. Another step forward. Questions. About that package. About those telegraph messages you've been sending. About why you knew exactly where to look in my barn. Sweat beaded on Whitaker's forehead despite the cold. His earlier confidence crumbled under the weight of Levi's quiet certainty. What? Do you want the truth? Tomorrow morning you're going to tell the sheriff everything about the railroad's plan. About the fake evidence? About all of it. Levi's voice hardened. Or I start asking those questions publicly, loud enough for everyone to hear. They'll never believe you over me, Whitaker snarled. But uncertainty crept into his tone. Maybe not. But once people start looking closer, they'll find the proof. Mrs. Boyle saw you with that package. The telegraph operator remembers your messages. Tom Henderson's boy heard your boasting. Each detail landed like a physical blow, making the deputy flinch. How many more witnesses you reckon I can find if I keep asking around? Silence filled the barn, broken only by the soft shuffling of horses in their stalls. Deputy Whitaker's face worked through a series of emotions: anger, fear, calculation. Finally, his shoulders sagged. The railroad will deny everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They'll say, I acted alone. Likely so. Levi didn't move from his blocking position, but Maribel goes free, and the water rights grant stands. The deputy's eyes darted around the barn like a trapped animal's, searching for an escape he wouldn't find. In the lantern's dim light, his badge cast a shadow that seemed to mock his predicament. Tomorrow morning, Levi repeated firmly, first light, or I start talking. Without waiting for a response, he stepped aside, clearing the way to the door. Deputy Whitaker hurried past, leaving his horse untended. His footsteps faded quickly in the snow outside. Levi remained in the barn for a long moment, his heart pounding harder than he'd let show during the confrontation. He'd gambled everything on this play: his ranch, his freedom, maybe even his life, if the deputy decided to resist. But thinking of Maribel in that cell, targeted for nothing more than defending those who couldn't defend themselves, he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. Now all he could do was wait for morning and pray the deputy's fear of exposure outweighed his ambition. Deputy Whitaker's boots scuffed against the livery's wooden floor as he turned back to face Levi. The lantern light caught the gleam in his eye, mean and mocking. Well, if it ain't the charitable Mr. Cade, Whitaker drawled, his hands still hovering near his gun belt. Tell me, what made you take in that half-breed thief? Getting lonely out there in your line shack? Levi's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. We both know she didn't steal anything, do we? The deputy's lips curled into a cruel smile. Seems to me you're awful certain about someone you just met. Maybe she charmed you with those pretty eyes of hers. Made you forget what side your bread's buttered on? The right side, Levi said quietly. The honest side. Whitaker barked out a laugh. Honest, don't pay Cade, but the railroad. Oh, God. He patted his coat pocket, which clinked with coins. How to reward loyalty. Could have had yourself a nice new grazing lease if you'd played along. Loyalty bought with bribes ain't loyalty at all. Bribes? The deputy's face darkened. Watch your mouth. I earned every cent helping keep order in this town. Order? Levi took a step forward, his shadow falling across Whitaker's face. Is that what you call framing an innocent woman, stealing water rights from widows? The deputy's hand dropped to his gun, but Levi was faster. His fist connected with Whitaker's jaw before the man could draw. The deputy stumbled backward, crashing into a feed barrel. Whitaker recovered quickly, launching himself at Levi with a roar. They grappled in the narrow aisle, sending chickens squawking and horses stamping in their stalls. The deputy fought. Dirty, trying to gouge eyes and kick knees. But Levi's size and ranch-hardened strength gave him the advantage. During the scuffle, Whitaker's coat caught on a nail. The fabric tore, spilling papers across the straw-covered floor. Letters fluttered down like autumn leaves, along with several official-looking receipts. The deputy's eyes went wide. He lunged for the documents, but Levi shoved him back, snatching up the nearest paper. Even in the dim light, the railroad's letterhead was clear as day. So were the numbers payments marked for services rendered in securing property rights. Let go of those. Whitaker's voice cracked with panic. Levi gathered the papers quickly, backing away as the deputy came at him again. This time, Whitaker's wild swing left him off balance. Levi seized the opportunity, grabbing the man by his shirt and belt. With one powerful heave, he tossed the deputy into the nearest empty stall. Not quite empty, as it turned out. Old Jack, the livery's bad-tempered mule, greeted his new stallmate with flattened ears and bared teeth. Levi slammed the stall door shut and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. Inside, Whitaker scrambled to his feet, pressing against the far wall to avoid Jack's threatening posture. "You can't leave me in here." The deputy's voice rose an octave as the mule took a menacing step toward him. "This is false imprisonment of an officer. Reckon you can think about false imprisonment while you keep Jack company." Levi tucked the damning papers securely inside his coat. He ain't much for conversation, but he's real particular about sharing his space. The mule's ears swiveled forward at the sound of his name, then pinned back again as he sized up his unwanted visitor. Whitaker pressed himself flatter against the wall. Levi didn't waste time savoring the moment. He moved quickly to saddle his sorrel gelding, checking the cinch twice before swinging into the saddle. Outside, fresh snowflakes were beginning to drift down from the dark sky. "You'll regret this, Cade." Whitaker's shout followed him out of the livery. "The railroad won't forget what you've done." Levi touched his heels to his horse's flanks, pointing them toward the circuit judge's home on the outskirts of town. The snow was falling harder now, but he knew every foot of this trail. More importantly, he knew Judge Callum would still be awake, probably reading by his fire as he did most nights. The papers in his coat felt like they were burning a hole straight through to his skin. After all the deputy's scheming, his own greed had finally brought him down. Those documents would do more than free Maribel. They'd expose the railroad's whole corrupt game. The night closed around him as he rode. Snow whisking past his face, his horse's hooves beating out a steady rhythm against the earth. Somewhere behind him, a coyote called out, long and lonely in the darkness. But Levi rode on, the weight of truth in his pocket, pushing him forward through the gathering storm. The night wind howled across the open prairie, driving needles of ice through Levi's heavy coat. His sorrel gelding plowed forward through deepening snow, steam rising from its flanks. The documents pressed against Levi's chest seemed to burn despite the bitter cold, each step bringing them closer to justice. The darkness before dawn was absolute. Only his horse's sure instincts and his own knowledge of the land kept them on the trail to Judge Callum's homestead. Twice they had to stop when the wind-driven snow became too thick to see through. Each time, Levi's fingers grew stiffer inside his leather gloves as he waited for the gusts to die down. His mind kept returning to Maribel, alone in that cold cell. The thought drove him forward despite the brutal weather. The sorrel sensed his urgency, maintaining a steady pace even as ice formed in its mane. The judge's homestead finally emerged from the darkness, a solid shape against the starless sky. A lamp still burned in the front window, its warm glow cutting through the swirling snow. Levi's heart lifted at the sight. He had counted on the judge's habit of reading late into the night. He dismounted stiffly, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. Leading his horse to the shelter of the barn, he approached the front door. His knuckles were nearly numb as he knocked, the sound barely carrying over the wind's moan. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened, spilling lamplight onto the snow. Judge Horace Callum stood in the doorway, still fully dressed despite the hour. His gray eyebrows rose at the sight of his late-night visitor, Levi Cade. The judge's deep voice held concern. What brings you out in this weather? Evidence? Your Honor? Levi's voice was hoarse from the cold. About the railroad and Deputy Whitaker. It can't wait until morning. The judge studied him for a moment, then stepped back. Come in before you freeze solid. Inside, the judge's sitting room was warm and quiet. A fire crackled in the hearth, and books lined the walls. The judge gestured Levi toward the flames while he stoked them higher. Now then, Judge Kellum said, settling into his chair. Show me what was worth risking your neck in this storm. Levi's fingers trembled slightly as he withdrew the papers from inside his coat. The documents were slightly crumpled but intact. He handed them to the judge, who adjusted his reading glasses and began to examine them in the firelight. These fell from Whitaker's coat during our disagreement, Levi explained. They show regular payments from the railroad, tied directly to Maribel's arrest and the widow's water rights. The judge's expression hardened as he read, his mouth settling into a grim line. He spread the papers across his desk, comparing dates and signatures. The only sound was the crack of burning wood and the endless keening of the wind outside. Systematic corruption, the judge finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Bribes, conspiracy, false imprisonment, all of it documented in their own hand. He looked up at Levi. Where's Deputy Whitaker now? Locked in a stall at the livery. With old Jack. A brief smile flickered across the judge's face. That mean-spirited mule. Fitting company, he gathered the papers carefully. We'll ride for town at first light. This ends now. Levi felt tension ease from his shoulders. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet. The judge's eyes were steel-hard. The railroad has powerful friends. This won't be simple. They waited out the remaining hours of darkness, the judge reviewing the evidence while Levi dozed in the chair by the fire. As gray light began to seep into the sky, they prepared to leave. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a crystalline morning. Their horses' hooves broke through crusted snow as they rode toward town. The judge was silent, the documents secure in his saddlebags. His face showed the same expression Levi had seen him wear before delivering difficult verdicts. Determined, uncompromising. They reached the courthouse just as the clerk was unlocking the front door. The young man's eyes widened at the sight of the judge, but he quickly ushered them inside. Judge Kellum strode directly to his chambers, motioning for Levi to follow. We'll need an immediate injunction, the judge said, pulling out official papers to prevent any retaliation while we sort this out. His pen scratched across the page as he wrote, the words precise and damning. This will stop them from touching the widow's land or water rights until a full hearing can be held. Levi stood quietly, watching the judge work. Outside the window, the town was coming awake. Smoke rose from chimneys, and early risers trudged through the snow. None of them knew yet how this day would reshape their community. When the judge finished writing, he sanded the ink and affixed his seal. Now, he said, rising from his desk, let's pay a visit to the sheriff's office. They walked the short distance down the street, their boots leaving sharp tracks in the fresh snow. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the world in shades of rose and gold. But Levi's thoughts were focused on what waited ahead on Maribel, and the justice that was finally within reach. The judge's bearing was straight and purposeful as they approached the sheriff's office. The injunction and evidence secure in his hands. His presence commanded attention, carrying the full weight of the law. Looking at him, Levi understood why the railroad's money had never swayed him. Some men's principles ran too deep to be bought. Sheriff Miller looked up from his morning coffee, startled as Judge Kellum strode through the door with Levi close behind. The lawman's weathered face showed confusion at the unexpected visit. his hand automatically moving toward his gun belt before recognizing the judge. "Your Honor?" The sheriff set down his cup. "What brings you here so early?" Kellum's voice filled the small office. "Release Miss Ortega immediately." The sheriff hesitated, glancing between the judge and Levi. But the deputy's evidence was fabricated. The judge pulled out the documents, spreading them across the sheriff's desk. Morning light streaming through the window illuminated the damning papers. These letters detail payments from the railroad to Deputy Whitaker, specifically tied to Miss Ortega's arrest. The sheriff's face darkened as he leaned forward to examine the evidence. Outside, early morning traffic had begun to pause, townspeople noticing the judge's presence at the jail. A small crowd started gathering, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. "Where is Deputy Whitaker?" the sheriff demanded. "Temporarily detained," Levi answered, his voice steady. "He'll need to answer for his actions." Judge Kellum cleared his throat and began reading from the first letter. His commanding voice carried through the open door to the growing crowd outside. Payment of $50 confirmed upon successful removal of Apache seamstress. Additional bonus of $100 upon securing property rights. ... Single quotes, the judge continued reading. Each word clear and devastating. The letters laid bare the railroad scheme, the planned theft accusation, the planted evidence, the systematic attempt to discredit Maribel and invalidate the widow's water rights. Mrs. Boyle pushed her way through the gathering crowd, her normally quiet voice sharp with anger. "I knew that deputy was crooked, strutting around like he owned the town." The sheriff's face had grown stormy. He stood, keys jangling as he moved toward the cells. "This is a disgrace to the badge." Then a commotion erupted outside. Deputy Whitaker, having somehow freed himself from the livery, came running down the street. His usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by straw-covered clothes and wild eyes. He'd clearly heard enough of the judge's reading to know his scheme had unraveled. "Stop him!" someone shouted. Two ranch hands who'd been loading feed at the mercantile reacted instantly. They charged forward, catching the deputy in a flying tackle that sent all three men sprawling in the snow. The deputy thrashed and cursed, but the ranch hands held firm. "Bring him in," the sheriff ordered, his voice hard with disappointment. Inside the jail, keys rattled against iron as the sheriff unlocked Maribel's cell. She stepped out slowly, dignity intact despite her ordeal. Her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears as she looked first at the judge, then found Levi's steady gaze. "Miss Ortega," Judge Kellum said formally, "you are cleared of all charges. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate injunction protecting the widow's settlement and its water rights." He turned to address the crowd, now filling the office and spilling onto the porch. "Any attempts to interfere with those rights will be met with the full force of the law." Maribel's voice was soft but clear. "Thank you, Your Honor." She squared her shoulders, finally allowing herself to smile. The widows will be relieved to know their homes are safe. The deputy was dragged in, still struggling. His formerly pressed shirt was torn and muddy, his arrogance replaced by desperate fear. "You can't prove anything. It's my word against your own writings." The judge cut in coldly, holding up the letters. "Your signature. Your receipts. Your conspiracy with the railroad, laid out in black and white." The sheriff grabbed the deputy's arm, steering him toward the now empty cell. "You're a disgrace to that badge, Whitaker. Hand it over." The morning sun streamed through the windows as Maribel stepped out of the jail. The cold air caught her breath in visible puffs, but her face was warmed by more than just sunlight. She paused on the porch, looking out at the gathered townspeople, seeing not accusation now, but sympathy and respect in their faces. Her eyes met Levi's again, and the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. But these were tears of relief, of vindication, of a burden finally lifted. Levi moved closer, offering quiet support as she faced the crowd. Mrs. Boyle pushed forward, wrapping a shawl around Maribel's shoulders. "Land's sakes, girl, you must be frozen. Come along to my place. I've got coffee brewing and fresh biscuits in the oven." Inside the jail, they could hear the judge continuing to read the evidence aloud, ensuring every detail of the railroad scheme was made public. The deputy's voice had fallen silent, the cell door clanging shut with finalizing force. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally arrived with the morning sun. The crowd began to disperse, moving in small groups through the snow-covered street. Their conversation a mix of indignation at the corruption and relief at its exposure. The truth had come to light, as bright and clear as the winter morning. Maribel stood straight and proud, the borrowed shawl around her shoulders, her ordeal behind her. The widow's homes and water were safe. The deputy's plot lay exposed and ruined in the snow, like the trampled ground where he'd made his final desperate run. The days following, Rebo's release brought a fresh energy to the widow's settlement. Morning frost still painted the ground white, but the strengthening February sun promised spring's eventual arrival. Women who had lived in fear now walked with renewed purpose, their laughter carrying across the packed snow as they went about their daily tasks. At the communal well, Levi worked alongside two of the younger widow's sons, showing them how to properly secure the wooden cover. His strong hands guided theirs as they hammered fresh boards into place. Maribel watched from where she helped Mrs. Thompson hang laundry, a small smile playing at her lips. "That man's been a godsend," Mrs. Thompson remarked, pinning a sheet to the line. "Never seen someone so capable with both wood and cattle." Maribel nodded, her dark hair catching the sunlight. "He sees what needs doing and does it. No fuss, no expectation of praise." Throughout the week, Levi hauled water barrels to the various cabins, ensuring everyone had enough stored for cooking and washing. The settled snow made the work easier, his horse's hooves finding firm footing on the packed trails. Often, Maribel walked beside him, carrying smaller buckets to the elderly widows who couldn't manage the heavier loads. During one such delivery, old Mrs. Carson insisted they stay for coffee. Her tiny cabin smelled of pine smoke and fresh bread. While she bustled about with cups and plates, Levi noticed a torn leather strap on her rocking chair. "Ma'am, I could fix that for you," he offered. Pulling out his repair kit, Maribel settled beside him as he worked, watching his practiced movements. "Show me," she asked softly. Levi guided her hands through the process of threading the heavy needle, explaining each step. "Just like with fabric," he said, "except you need more force. See how the awl makes the hole first." Her fingers proved as skilled with leather as they were with cloth. Soon they worked in comfortable silence, the chair between them, while Mrs. Carson hummed an old hymn by the stove. The next day, Maribel returned the favor. As they walked the settlement's fence line checking for winter damage, she pointed to a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "B," she said carefully, then smiled at his attempt to repeat the word. In Apache, it means red-tail. My mother taught me all their names. A western meadowlark called from a nearby fence post. Without prompting, Maribel offered its name to T.S. Pei. Her voice carried the words with gentle pride, sharing pieces of her heritage as naturally as breathing. When Sunday arrived, the little church was fuller than usual. Even some of the ranch hands who normally spent the day sleeping showed up, curious about what the preacher might say after recent events. Levi sat near the back, as was his habit, but found himself distracted by Maribel's presence several pews ahead. Her dark head bowed in prayer. Reverend Matthews chose his text from the Book of Psalms. "Truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven." His sermon wove together the ancient words with their community's recent trials. Speaking of how truth, though sometimes buried, would always find its way to light. We've seen this past week the preacher's voice rolled through the wooden church. How the mighty don't always prevail. How God's justice can work through ordinary folks willing to stand for what's right. Through a seamstress brave enough to protect her neighbors. Through a rancher willing to risk his own security for the truth. Maribel kept her eyes forward, but her shoulders straightened at the words. Levi studied his hands, uncomfortable with the attention, but knowing the preacher spoke true. After the service, as people lingered to talk in the weak winter sunshine, Levi found himself beside Maribel on the church steps. She spoke first, her voice carrying the same quiet strength he'd come to know. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in the truth, when it would have been easier not to." Levi nodded, watching the townspeople scatter toward their Sunday dinners. "Truth's like water," he replied after a moment. "Finds its own way if you don't block the path." She smiled at that, understanding in her eyes. Together they walked toward the widow's settlement, their boots leaving parallel tracks in the fresh snow. While overhead the red-tailed hawk, the bees circled in the clearing sky. Evening settled over the widow's settlement like a heavy quilt, drawing long shadows across the packed snow. Widow Jensen's woodpile had dwindled dangerously low, so Levi and Maribel had spent the last hour stacking fresh-cut logs against her cabin wall. The work had kept them warm despite the dropping temperature, their breath forming small clouds in the deepening dusk. "That should see her through the next few weeks," Levi said, adjusting his gloves. He studied the neat rows of split pine with satisfaction, knowing it would keep the elderly woman's hearth burning. Maribel brushed sawdust from her skirts and nodded. "Mrs. Jensen can rest easier now." She glanced up at the heavy sky, where thick clouds promised more snow. "We should head back before the weather turns." They walked side by side along the familiar path to Levi's shack, their boots crunching in rhythm through the crusty snow. The silence between them felt comfortable, filled with the evening sounds of settling cattle and distant coyotes. "I never properly thanked you," Maribel said suddenly, her voice soft but clear in the still air. "For standing beside me when everyone else looked away. It would have been easier to pretend you never found me that night." Levi slowed his pace. Considering her words, the memory of finding her bound and frightened in that alley seemed from another lifetime, though barely a month had passed. "Truth is," he said carefully, "you did more for me than I did for you." He paused, gathering thoughts that had been building like storm clouds. "After Sarah passed, I just ... existed. Worked cattle. Survived winters. But you reminded me, life can be more than just getting by." Maribel's dark eyes met his, understanding flowing between them like a quiet stream. They had reached his porch now, the lantern he'd left burning in the window casting a warm glow across the weathered boards. The first snowflakes began to fall, large and soft, catching in Maribel's black hair like scattered stars. Levi found himself studying her face in the golden light, seeing both the strength that had carried her through her trials and the gentleness that showed in her care for others. Time seemed to slow as he leaned down, his heart thundering like spring rivers. 12 years since he'd kissed anyone, 12 years of lonely nights and empty mornings. But as his lips met hers, tender and tentative, the years melted away like snow in sunshine. The lantern light spilled around them, turning the falling snow to gold, while somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark offered one last evening song. Spring arrived like a gentle awakening, turning the harsh white landscape into a canvas of fresh green and wildflower gold. The last patches of snow retreated into shadowy hollows, surrendering to warm afternoon breezes and lengthening days at the widow's settlement. Gardens flourished in neat rows behind whitewashed picket fences, while the secured water rights meant every plot had its share of life-giving moisture, coaxing tender shoots from the dark soil. Beans climbed sturdy poles, and early peas promised sweet harvests to come. Near the community well, children's laughter rang out clear as birdsong. Little Tommy Jensen pushed his younger sister on a rope swing, while Sarah Miller skipped rope, her red braids bouncing. The sound of splashing water and playful shouts echoed across the settlement, a testament to the peace they'd fought so hard to protect. Inside the church hall, sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the long wooden tables where the community gathered for Sunday dinner. The scent of fresh-baked bread and roasted chicken filled the air. Mingling with the sweet perfume of lilacs Mrs. Boyle had arranged in mason jars down the center of each table. Maribel sat beside Levi, her dark hair caught up with silver combs that caught the light. When Mrs. Boyle shared a story about her husband's first attempt at making biscuits hard as horseshoes, I tell you, Maribel's laughter bubbled up pure and free. Her hand brushed against Levi's as she reached for the butter dish, a touch that sent warmth through his weathered fingers. The simple contact brought him back to that snowy night in the alley, when he'd found her bound and desperate. Her words echoed in his memory. Please, cut these ropes. Looking at her now, radiant with joy and belonging, Levi realized a profound truth. In helping to free her that night, he'd begun his own liberation from grief, from isolation, from the tight bonds of solitude he'd wrapped around his heart. The afternoon light softened as folks began gathering their dishes and bidding farewell. Levi and Maribel stepped out into the mild spring air, walking close together on the path toward home. Behind them, the church bell tolled 5 times, its clear notes carrying across the greening valley. They walked unhurried, sharing comfortable silence and the promise of tomorrow. Fresh grass sprouted along the path edges, and meadowlarks called from fence posts. Everything spoke of renewal, of hope taking root and flourishing, just like the tender feelings growing between them, nurtured by trust and time. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.